Everyone has this picture of Snow White and seven dwarfs in their head, with all the animals around. That is not wildlife rehabilitation. There's rescuing an animal and then there's responsibly rescuing an animal. With wildlife, we've dealt with more than 250 species. So we've literally stuck a leopard in the MRI machine.
It's crazy. You don't think of all these things when you think of rescue or rehabilitation.
Keeping wildlife wild is the most important thing.
What are the 3 messages you would like to pass on?
The new trend is to have exotic wild pets. If you are worried about things like that, you shouldn't be doing this work only. So everybody who has all these Alexandrine and rose-ring parakeets and plum-headed parakeets and Indian star tortoises and all that jazz, those are just illegal to keep.
Our guest today is a firm believer that animals require the same level of care and professionalism as any human sector. Her animal rescue facility has grown from a single car and a 2-member team to multiple rescue facilities with over 130 people across Maharashtra. Her 24/7 emergency helpline has become a go-to for anyone who finds an animal in need. She is the founder of Rescue Charitable Trust, Neha Panchamla.
Thank you for driving all the way to come to Bangalore to be part of this podcast. We really appreciate you taking the time out. And while we were doing our research, we read about you, we looked at the interviews and the podcast or different videos, what has been published. I have a question to ask. Today, how do you define yourself? As you started with the domesticated animals, maybe call it stray also, and then you moved into the wildlife. So how do I see you? Is it a animal welfare person or as a wildlife conservationist?
I don't think that you can really separate those two.
Okay.
I do believe that to be a good conservationist, I think that you have to, be concerned about animal welfare as well. So conservation is about wildlife, animals, we're all interconnected. So I don't think those are mutually exclusive.
Okay.
And I think you don't have to choose between being one. So I'd say I'm both and many more things. And I also, to answer your question about, how, I started with this, and without speaking about the transition very much, the one thing that I'd like to say is I believe it has massively worked to our advantage. When I say our, I mean my own and the team, to actually have worked with domestics as compared to wildlife. And believe me, I know when I say this, it's actually more challenging to work with domestic animals, especially when it comes to the kind of work we do. Simply because with domestic animals, there is nature and nurture. So for example, if you have to capture a bull that is rabid, for example, right? It already knows how to navigate itself around humans. It knows how to dodge us. It knows our capability, right? So capturing it is actually more challenging. Whereas I think capturing a leopard is far easier. There's no nurture involved over there. It is absolutely wild. If you've understood its behavior, you have the right equipment, you have a team that understands safety, you think 2 steps ahead of it because you're able to predict the behavior. It's actually simpler. So I feel in many ways, we find it simpler. And we had many years of animal capture behind us and challenging ones, because domestic animals are actually far harder as compared to wild animals. So I think the transition has been easier, if I may say so. Of course, with domestic animals, the species are limited. With wildlife, we've dealt with more than 250 species. So managing each one is different. But yeah, I mean, the transition happened several years ago now, and for certain reasons.
So Neha, you did masters in medical science in human nutrition. You also worked in one of the healthcare organizations. You also worked as a graphic designer and a media consultant. How did animals happen?
So I think I've always, ever since I was really little, I was one of those kids who was always fascinated, seeing an animal. I think I went to boarding school, which was in the mountains. And I think for the first time at that point, I felt like I was the outsider. And I think that's where it began for me. And then there have been like 1 or 2 trigger points where I've always felt really strongly about not watching animals in pain or suffering. Like, to me, whether the outcome is life or death is very secondary. We're all going to die.
Yes.
What we can hope for our loved ones or friends and family is that there is least suffering when that happens. Yes. And I feel like at least we are able to express our pain, whereas with animals, that is not possible. And I feel, so whenever I'd watch an animal suffering, I think it began for me, I was very sensitive to that when I was very, very young. And I always felt like, why couldn't something be done about this? So in fact, the first thing I wanted to be in my life was a veterinarian. But I have a family of human doctors, my mom's side. And they were like, no, the human race needs you more than the animal race. And let's just say I didn't have too much of my own mind back then, or I didn't put my foot down. And I did give my CET, did all of that. But I picked my next love in life, which was food. So that's how nutrition happened. But it's been really interesting because even that, my very strong base in nutrition and medical science is what's really helped me with this work as well. Also, my master's was done by research. So again, my focus on data and things like that, all that base came from that. The graphic design simply happened because, after doing my nutrition, I was working with a healthcare company. And, by that time I was 22, 23, and I would keep seeing animals hurt, injured. I'd reached that point where I was like, I'm going to stop pointing fingers at others. I'm just going to do something myself. It's very easy to just talk about why is the government not doing this, or why are NGOs not doing this, or why is no organization doing this. At one point, I think you just stop complaining and you just decided to do it yourself. And I think at that point, my father said, beggars don't do charity. I said, but I can't do a 9-to-5 or 9-to-6 job, a desk job, which is what that nutrition job was. And, do what I want to do for animals. And so basically, and what I did know from the start was, yes, I want to do this, but if I really want to make an impact, I cannot be a one-man show. So I knew that, an organization was the way forward. So I went and registered the organization when I was 23 and started off back then. But the graphic design happened because organization has to have a logo. Now, I didn't have any money at that point. It was very limited. I'd also went part-time on my job and then finally quit the job. And then I figured that this work, if my work, I told my dad, I know beggars don't do charity, I'll figure it out. So that's when I started graphic design. It sort of began with doing stuff for my organization. I had a friend who was a really good graphic designer, watched him and learned. At that point, I'm saying 2006, 2007, at that point, there were hardly any videos. I don't even know if YouTube was there, but it's not as easy as, watch 10 videos and learn today. I remember having to just sit quietly, shadow someone. So started doing that because I figured my work could be on the laptop. And so that's how graphic design. Then again, through animals, met someone who was into development. So again, data, systems, design, everything sort of went together. We started making these custom ERPs for rescue itself, so which is why I have so much data stemming back from over a decade, because we've always maintained that. So I think one thing just sort of, wove into another, and the graphic design again just kicked off. I have always been on the artistic side, just never pursued it, and I suppose this became a way of expressing it. So started the company back then, and so it gave me the flexibility to be able to do what I love, and then also on the other side be able to do something else. Work hours are really long for me. I used to work at a veterinary clinic and do graphic design and do the rescue work. So between that, there was no time for anything else. So I was just working, but I was at least doing everything that I loved. And
So I really like this philosophy, because this is the normal tendency of everybody, most of the people, is that we just put a blame on somebody else. That this is government's job, forest department's job, this department job. But we as an individuals, as human beings, we own certain responsibilities. And the day we realize it, we start acting on it. And it's great that you actually acted on it and end up creating an organization like Rescue. So your father, he made a statement that this can't be doing charity, but he's also a big supporter of your work.
Yes. So my dad's always been a massive supporter. I mean, I come from a Gujarati family, which has been into business and, those, and business family will always see ups and downs, very conscious in that sense. Nobody in my family ever, been associated with social causes or anything like that. Like, they had no clue. For my mom, it was like, I remember some famous dietitian, she would keep quoting me, "You studied so much, you're so bright, you could be like her, me making so much money." I'm like, yeah, mom, it will get there, just not that form. I said, plus, I used to joke with her that people need psychologists more than dietitians when they want to lose weight. But so I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. And so I think it was more out of fear that my mom maybe was not sure what I'm going to do or something like that. But and I think for almost 4 years, she'd be like, you can still go back to doing that. And I was just like, no, I'm in this and now I'm in this now and I'll figure it out one way or the other. And I think when you're trying something new, you're always, exploring, making mistakes, learning, trying something new, so they've seen me through all of that. But Dad's just always been a supporter. I think if I've believed in something, he's just believed in me. So
that is so great.
Yeah.
That's that you have somebody who's behind you saying that, okay, fine, go ahead. Find your calling, do what you want to do it.
That but at the same time also insisted that I remain independent. So it wasn't like, oh, you want to do this? Okay, here, take everything for it. Like we've always, my brother and me, we both have always had to work hard for whatever we wanted. So yeah, he's had our back. But yeah, he's been and of course,
I think
that
you have your own struggle and you figure it out at how this is required.
Definitely. Yeah.
And so, were you very clear that you are going to start off Rescue as an organization, or it was more about trying to figure out that, okay, what can I do?
I feel
basically what I'm asking is that how did you end up creating Rescue?
Correct. So you see, I think most of us who, I think you require some, it's like a trigger that happens, right? You don't always know exactly what you're going to do, but there's something that's driving you to say, okay, I have to find a solution to this. At that point, I think the solution, the problem was more internal. Like I mentioned before, I can't watch animals suffer, but that's a me problem, right? But me rescuing one animal and doing that is not solving the world's problems. And I think that is something that I realized over time. But so if you ask me, did I have a clear plan? Did you think at the age of 23, we'd be providing aid to a blue whale that has been beached or catching 3 leopards and a tiger in a span of 24 hours? No, I did not know that. But yes, the vision was there that I wanted to help animals. I knew that I wanted to be organized, which is why from day one, registered the organization, always marched forward with that, always knew that I'm going to experiment, probably going to make mistakes, but I knew I wanted to do it professionally. And I knew I wanted to do it that way. I also felt like the struggle that I went through, not knowing how to go about this, I felt like animals needed more support. And I felt like if I create something, maybe 10 years later, maybe this becomes a career option for people. Maybe this becomes that, where I didn't really have one. So yeah, I didn't really have an exact, like people think I had some vision when I was 23. No, I didn't. I just had drive. I knew I wanted to do something and I feel like I never settle. I just want to do better.
How many employees do you have now?
Sorry?
I'm just saying, how many team members do you have it now?
I think about 135 full-time.
So what you just said that, this as a career option.
Yes.
Wow. 135 people. That's
so
amazing.
when you were young, what was the rescue landscape like at that time? Obviously, you would have looked at other people,
See, now if you looked at it from the domestic side, it was compassion, misguided compassion, as I call it, very often driven. It was more about this very good Samaritan sort of syndrome where, you pick up an animal, provide the aid and you release it back, not necessarily knowing the consequences of doing that.
And most of the time it's like half-baked, right?
It's very half-baked, yes. I think I always say there's rescuing an animal and then there's responsibly rescuing an animal. I think that stands true for domestic or wildlife, even in today's date. But I think the rescue landscape back then, when it came to domestics, again, I remember when I moved to Pune, there was not one single emergency ambulance. Fast forward to even 2017-18, when we actually started working with wildlife, and that's simply because the place we were, Pune's landscape changed so much. The city grew so much. I mean, I feel like everything we do, we use the word rescue, but actually you're mitigating human-wildlife conflict and all the effects of all the anthropogenic pressures that these, or sort of anthropogenic, what I mean to say is basically all the pressures that have been put on animals because of increasing human needs. So I feel that, the scene has changed a lot. I feel rescue was viewed as this very heroic act. And in fact, that greatly upsets me because all these heroic acts are often unnecessarily risky operations, which they don't need to be that way. If you look at how the world is doing wildlife capture, there are safer ways to do it without stressing the animal out, without putting yourself at risk. So I feel like that has seen change over the last few years, where wildlife capture has to become professional, whether it's the act of singly rescuing an animal. What is rescuing an animal? Just basically pulling an animal that's in distress out of it. But while doing that, even that process has to be good. So I feel like at that point, the rescue landscape, I don't think anyone was doing that. I think it's always been pursued as this very heroic act. And I feel like that narrative needs to change. People need to start looking at this differently.
I think if you go back in time, 2006-07 period of time, I don't even know if any organization existed. Private organization existed doing the rescue, specifically in a wildlife space. Domesticated, as you said.
There were people in the domestic space. I mean, you have some that are shelters, some are focused on different aspects of it, right? Even if you even conservation, it's a very big word. There's so many different focus areas. Also, if you look at protection, right, wildlife protection, I mean, if you see, it's very nascent in that sense. I mean, for India, only post-72 is when it went from hunting to protection.
Yes.
Now, protection was, of course, spaces, habitats. It is in the last decade and a half where, the other factors which have been putting, say, wildlife in distress, and development is important for our country, there is no doubt about it. But on the other hand, the effects that we've been seeing, all very broadly can be classified into human-wildlife interactions, or which then get converted into, conflict situations. I feel that has risen. Maybe there wasn't a need 30 years ago, but today there is.
You're right. Yes. 30 years ago, maybe
and today
that
there
need was
is.
not there. Yes.
Today.
See, the problem is not with the development.
No.
The problem is with the unplanned development, unscientific development. That is where the whole problem is. Because if you have done the proper research, like, for example, we talk about NH44, the highway which cuts Pinch, and then you're able to go to your destination. There are corridors for the animals to move. They've also put the barricades so the noise doesn't travel of the vehicles. That is one of the great case studies to talk about it. So when you put research, you put a science into the development, you are able to do development in which you're not harming that much to the natural resources or the animals. But yeah, I mean, that is a problem, I think, not only India, but most of the places.
Yes, and I think that, as you correctly said, this is not just an India issue.
Yeah.
Human-wildlife conflict, this word coexistence we keep talking about. I also think it's like energy, it'll keep changing forms.
Yeah.
And the idea is to mitigate, to have a management plan. And I think the need for that, the incident numbers have increased in the last maybe decade and a half, and there is a need to properly manage it.
Is the number increased, or
maybe the reporting is increased?
Increased,
yes,
maybe.
So the reporting is increased, or the numbers have increased. So I think I think the beautiful thing about wildlife, especially, is that they too adapt. Okay, but in that process where they're adapting, right? So the challenges that happen then, I feel if they're dealt with sensitively. For example, there is, for Pune, for example, every direction in Pune, people are sighting leopards, right? So the thing is, the leopards have probably always been there.
Yeah.
The city has grown.
Yeah.
The number of CCTVs has increased.
Yes.
Everyone has smartphones now.
Yeah.
Otherwise, somebody would have, I think I saw something like a large cat, but that confirmation was not there. The animal went on its way. People went on with their lives. Today, everything is documented. Today,
And you have this sort of cycle on social media where they keep posting it.
which
and
keeps
it's-
looping, you know, on that sense. So I feel like today, the way we deal with the situation, and I feel like if it is not dealt with, in fact, so much of the work our team does is not necessarily going and doing wildlife capture or even the rehabilitation work. In fact, say if we in terms of data, if you look at it, about 6,000 to 7,000 wildlife per year, if we provide aid to, I think the numbers are probably 60, 70,000 people every year that we have direct interactions to reduce or sort of prevent human-wildlife conflict. In fact, that work is so much more important to just prevent the disaster from happening to begin with. So I think that has changed a lot. And because people are reporting more, you know, because they're seeing it more. So it's possibly that as well.
Yeah, 30 years ago, we never had these methods of communication which we have right now.
Exactly.
And that is helping us. Also mitigating because you are getting to know about these things also much faster. So what was a trigger when you decided that all the work what you did for more than a decade and then you decided to get into a wildlife rescue from a domesticated animal?
Over the years, I think this, you know, when I say this stemmed from I can't watch animals suffering, that's a me thing. But I also asked myself, I rescue 5,000-10,000 domestic animals every year, but what problem did I solve? Then I realized that this has to change on a policy level. You know, there have to be policy level changes. I am not achieving anything beyond a warm, fuzzy feeling. Rescuing an animal and putting it back out on the street like that, you know, I didn't think I was seeing the full circle. And the other thing is, like I said, Pune changed a lot. There were also, over the years, there were several other that one point in 2006 and 2007, there was not one emergency domestic animal ambulance. By the time 2013, 14, in fact, so many others that I have helped set up, you know, to do emergency rescue, because I also realized that one organization alone can't do this work. So I felt that so many people would, since we had a hospital, people would pick up birds, people would pick up small mammals, bring them to the hospital. And I also knew these were wild animals. So I would report them to the forest department and see someone has come here and left this bird here. And what do we do? Where do we send it? And then it reached a point where they were like, oh, create another section and why don't you treat it yourself? And I was like, okay, then let's do this on paper, because I always wanted to keep everything official. And so yeah, I feel the transition also happened because there were not enough, there was no dedicated wildlife rescue organization, and the cases were escalating. So I felt the need to move into that space also because I could live with it, because I also felt that we were not doing justice. We were not doing right by the animals in the work that we were doing. I also felt that wildlife needed. So I also feel with the evolving needs of the world, you too have to evolve. Maybe 10 years down the line, we don't need to do wildlife rescue. Maybe we don't need to do it for some reason. But there will always be, there will be a purpose to find or to serve. So I feel like we evolved because the environment around us needed it.
How difficult it was to convince the government or the forest department that this is what you would like to do for the...
No, actually, it was not difficult to convince. I think actually it was a very mutual sort of decision, sort of something that we arrived at. We had the skill to do it. We had the space to do it. They made the provisions to enable that. I am actually really grateful to the Maharashtra Forest Department. We would not be able to do the work we do today without their support. I think the role of an NGO is to fill a gap. And I think they realize that we understand that we are here to fill a gap. We are highly motivated. Also, I think because we always have tried to run a professional setup. We have full-time people working. It's not entire. Of course, we have volunteers, but the day-to-day work to keep the organization and the operations running at the capacity it should, we have full-time employees. So I also felt they could depend on us and we could depend on them for support. Of course, we formalized, the whole... the work that we do. So I felt like we, maybe the department and us, we're filling in a gap here. We're not here to replace anyone. We're not here to do that. We're here to fill a gap that is there. If that gap gets met, then, we move on to the next thing. And that's how it works. So I don't think it's difficult. I think a lot of people have this thing in their head that working with the government is very difficult. But I'll tell you what, most of us just go to governmental departments
Asking for something.
Either asking for something or just leaving the problem on their desk.
Yeah,
How
not
many
going
of
with the
us
solution.
are willing
Yeah.
to say, hey, here's the problem, here's the solution, here's what I can do, and can you do this too? I feel like when you become a part of the solution, it does get accepted. I still haven't, faced a challenge in working with and this is not just the forest department. We've worked with the animal husbandry, with the local, municipal corporations, with other departments. And I think if you have, as an NGO, as an individual, if you have the right attitude, it's not so challenging because even they realize that they have limitations, just the same way we have limitations. So if you play to your strengths, you are going to achieve a good outcome.
So when you were putting your processes in place for running the organization, because you said you've handled over 240 species, right? So each animal has its own biology.
Yes, yes.
Rescuing one animal is very different from a bird, is different from a reptile.
Absolutely.
So when you do you know any countries or places where they really cracked rescue, and is there something that you learned from places where they really solve these issues?
So multiple things. So because we're dealing with multiple species, not just even in fact I wouldn't just classify it into bird, mammal, reptiles. Even if you look at birds, the different types of birds, raptors have to be handled very differently from wetland species to the smaller birds, especially in mammals. I mean, large carnivores, felines, canids, there are some, so what we've done over time, like I said, we've always been about data. Like even the smallest bird to every single animal, we have it documented, every single intervention that we've done. We have species-specific SOPs. The good thing is, has anyone cracked it? No, because you're always learning. But the good thing that has happened, for example, we have a green sea turtle right now, which was found beached, came to us. We have handled some of them before, but this one, is a case where, so it has the boat, the mark, the rotor marks, it's been cut with that, and it has buoyancy issues. We've consulted with, vets from Queensland who are seeing these cases day in, day out. Like for certain, initially the early days when we would get the first few pangolins, we consulted with these vets in South Africa. So they were incredible. They just, gave us all the information we needed. Now our doctors are, sitting and writing SOPs on, how to do things because we've adapted it to Indian species. And that was what was challenging and also fun about doing this work is that there is no guide. There is no book that will tell you. There is a lot of information on how to keep on zoo husbandry, how to keep animals captive for life. But there is no book, especially related to Indian species or any guides that will tell you how to ensure that the animal remains wild and how to reintroduce it back into its natural habitat. So what we did is, because we'd been documenting this data very meticulously on a system that we'd created, we have now been able to put together, these SOPs information. So for example, an orphan jungle cat comes to you. You're just sitting and guessing, oh, how old is this?
Correct.
Today, we don't have to do that guesswork because we've gone through so many. We now have an aggregate of their weights. Okay, this is the weight. This is what it's looking like. This is what the coloration is. It's probably between 4 to 5 weeks, So this has come over time. So it's not just about rescuing the animal. It's also about creating valuable information databases that will hopefully be useful for the future.
Is this data, which you have been capturing for so many years, available in a public domain?
So it is not available in public domain because where do I publish this unless I'm writing books, which I don't have the time to do right now. But this information is with the Forest Department, number one. Number two, we have these SOPs. Also, there aren't so many wildlife rescue organizations.
But if
So
somebody
who do-
wants to access, they can reach out to your organization.
They can
and-
reach out to
Yeah,
us.
yeah.
But again, it's because what happens, like I said, with wildlife rescue, a lot of people think that they can do it at home. You
Yeah.
can't really
You
do
cannot.
this.
You
You cannot do this at home. So you
need the
have to be
facilities.
careful about who the information goes to. I mean, there have been organizations that have reached out, some from Bangalore itself, and we've shared SOPs, improved our own, or the ones in other countries have shared theirs with us, and we vice versa. So I think if there are organizations who reach out, we've been doing that. In fact, we've been sort of planning to come up with some kind of convention for people who are into wildlife rescue and rehabilitation, because we don't have anything where there is this knowledge exchange happening, not in India at least.
Yeah.
So I think that needs to happen. But it's not available on public domain. But if anyone reaches out, it's definitely available.
So Neha, you also have a response vertical. And you have a 24 hours helpline
Helpline.
or a call line. How random calls do you guys receive?
Very random calls. I mean, we run a 24-hour helpline. And on an average, we get, depending on the day, season, could be between 60 to 100 calls a day. Not all of them need to be responded to. A lot of them are just explaining. So people sometimes think the animal is in distress, but it's not. Or the animal is behaving just how it should. For example, there was this one really funny call where this lady called and said, and I was on the phone. I picked, the helpline was, lying near me, and I picked it up, and she said, there's a monkey on the tree. I said, please describe what's happening. So she started describing the monkey. I said, okay, it is a langur. What's happened? Is it injured? Is it stuck in something? No, it's just sitting. And I said, okay. She said, it could come down and bite us. I said, ma'am, where is it? Is it in the house? Is it come into your balcony? Anything like that? No, it's come into our colony and, but it could come down and bite us. And there are children playing down. So I explained to her that, that there is 2 times in the year, these langurs do migrate and, they pass through the city. I said, make sure you have no open garbage bins, blah, blah, blah. She said, no, she said, no, you have to come in and take it right now. And she was adamant. I was just, so I had to explain to her that, see, unless it is injured or, it has caused injury to someone, I will need to inform the forest department then and wait for their instructions on what to do ahead. I said, if it is just sitting, it is doing on a tree. That too, a monkey will sit on the tree. So, there's stuff like this, or sometimes there's some really, people will call us for a rat. And I was just like, yeah, there's just not. Then I have to explain to people like, listen, we will cover the species that are listed in the Wildlife Protection Act. So yeah, oh my God. Sometimes very unreasonable requests and things like that. Bizarre situations. Yeah, all kinds. We get the randomest calls. Yeah, we really do.
So where did you get the idea of starting the 24/7 helpline?
Oh, from day one. We have a helpline that's been running since 2007.
Okay.
So we've always had an animal helpline. And I think that too came from a place where, you don't know who to reach out for help. You don't know whether it's a situation that needs to be acted on or not. So several times we're just counseling people, giving them information or making sure somebody doesn't intervene when intervention is not required.
Yeah.
So I
That
think
also is
that's
important.
another very important role that the helpline plays. Just dispenses the right information.
Yeah, it's become a medium to communicate with people and educate them also. because
Yes,
most of the time they have zero
absolutely.
information.
Absolutely. In fact, sometimes it's just because they don't know better.
Yeah, they don't
And
know.
then people make more responsible decisions when they know better. So I
Yeah.
think the helpline is really important to do that.
You also have a vertical which is prevention vertical, in which you also go and do the camps to educate
Workshops.
People.
workshops.
Yeah. So we
Also work with the government bodies in formulating policies.
Okay. So the prevention side is multiple things that we do. It's when it comes to community awareness and education, we essentially all our work can be sort of divided into two parts. One is a very formal structured program, which is called AWARE. And there's another one that's called Sajivan, which means coexistence. And the Sajivan program is basically one where we go to, and that is conducted a lot. Those are more single sessions. It depends who the target audience is. So if we are going to a village and we know that whether it's leopards or snake related, these are the challenges they face. So the Sajivan programs are always focused on dispensing information that is valuable to people. It is about safety for themselves, which indirectly becomes safety for the animals as well.
Is it this particular program or the camps, you do it more in the villages, or
we do both?
Both. Okay.
So I would say more in the peri-urban areas,
Okay.
on the fringes and in villages, because that's where, for example, the challenges with leopards, coexisting with
Yes.
leopards is becoming a larger challenge, especially in the western region of Maharashtra. And in the city, the AWARE programs this is more of a school program. So the AWARE program is a school program. It's continuous through the grades, and it's more focused on whether to rescue or not. About the exotic wildlife trade, because the new trend is to have exotic wild pets. And so basically getting kids to understand right from the get-go what's okay, what's not okay. How to prevent a bite from happening. This whole thing about stray dogs, no stray dogs. If that fear can be dealt with at a very young age. So the AWARE program is a more structured program which is done in schools, largely in cities and several cities. But the Sajivan program, so that is very important because we proactively do it. We don't wait for a problem to happen. So we do that along with the forest department. So suppose we are going to a village, the forest guard from that area will also be at the program with us. So we put up a united front. It gives people more confidence that if anything happens, there is somebody who will respond, and these people work together, we're taken care of. So half that fear goes there only.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important. And I think several times going and talking to people after an incident has happened is not always is not always beneficial. But if you do it in advance, if they are better prepared or they know who to reach out to, we've seen so many places which would have been easily become disaster zones. But those are prevented because we are continuously going and interacting with the community.
Have you had any people who you met during these workshops who have come back to say, okay, we want to work with you, or we want to join?
Yes, so many. So in fact, several people who work with us, who have come to know us through these, initiatives that we do and said, I am interested in doing this. In fact, one of the things that we've started is, we piloted it a couple of years ago, was the remote squad concept, the rescue remote squad concept. Firstly, this sector was never looked at one where you could formally work in. There's so many people who love wildlife. They would either rescue the animals in their villages or towns, or then think that they had to only do certain streams to be a part of this sector. Also, wildlife is everywhere. We can't be everywhere. We recognize that as well. So what we started doing is identifying, youth in certain areas where we get a lot of calls from, the ones who've been involved when we do these community programs. We bring them to Pune, train them up, equip them, put them on a salary. So what they're doing is they're responding to calls faster when there is a response needed. In the time where there is no rescues happening, their only job is to go interact with the community, do these sessions, so that you're preparing the community in advance, if in case something happens, and basically just provide, giving out good safety information so that the animals that live and share our spaces, are better accepted. So that's the idea. Everyone doesn't have to leave their villages and towns to come and work with wildlife. Yeah. And the other thing that I've noticed is when you go as an outsider to a village when a situation has happened, they'll say, you don't live here.
Yeah.
What do you know our problems?
Yeah.
Right?
100%.
But when you have these guys there who live there, and they are the ones dispensing that information. They are also living there. They are also facing the same challenges. It's accepted a lot better.
100%. So there is, the other program what you run, which has to do with the awareness about the wildlife. I personally believe that our education system needs to change. Somewhere this has to become a proper course.
A lot of children display very naturalistic intelligence. The kids who are collecting the stones and bringing the leaves home and the stones home, and those are actually signs, and I feel a lot of children have that naturalistic intelligence. Everyone grows up, one of the first few things you teach babies and children is what does the cow do, or how does this one sound, right? Everyone has that natural affinity. In fact, it's actually called the AWARE curriculum. So it's a 8-module program, and a lot of schools are adopting it now. In fact, the next stage to that is to train the teachers to do it.
100%.
So that is what we are doing, because that's something, and absolutely right. And it needs to become a part of because you see all those, even the poorer decisions that happen with the exotic wild pets and things like that. It's also just because the children have an affinity, and that is what they think they can access. And if they knew better, they would make better choices.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah.
I completely agree with you. So with regard to working with the government bodies and organizations, what kind of initiatives you could work on, or what kind of policy interventions you could do?
So I think it's been a lot of the work that we have been doing with the government on policy-related, any kind of policy-related matters has got a lot to do with management of human-wildlife conflict.
Okay.
So largely in that space. Also in the space of management of captive animals. So I feel like in these two areas, also we've done some work on because we understand with the landscape and, understanding this rising challenge of, managing human-wildlife interactions. I feel like all the work we've done has been related to that. Again, so I feel very often in order to find solutions, you have to know this, you have to know your problem, you have to understand your problem size. So we've been doing some work related to doing statewide surveys, making sense of the data, based on the data, coming up with solutions, which then the department is then, formulating their policy around. So I feel like we're partners with the department in helping them arrive at good policy that is actually implementable on ground. So I feel as grassroots, people who work on the grassroots, you will understand what will work or not work. And I feel even the department has been quite open to listening to these, opinions, suggestions, and taking them when they come. So I feel being on some certain committees where that decisions are going to be taken based on the outcome of this. It's been quite incredible to be a part of those and to be included with that. So I think we've been working at that level. Or the conservation reserves that have been, notified in Maharashtra, making, management plans for them. Because while we are, the intention is to protect the habitat, how is it going to be managed better? So just declaring it is one thing, but actually making sure the management plans are going to help the flora, fauna, and the people who live in and around those areas. So I think, again, my team member and I helped the department write about 10 of those management plans. Wow. So yeah, I mean, different things, but all related to the sort of sector that we have been sort of working in.
And how difficult is it? Like, you've had wins with the State Department, State Forest Department, and the state itself. How difficult is it to expand this to a national level? Say if you arrive on really good policies SOPs and things like that for say handling animals and rescuing animals. How does it translate? If you want to bring it out at a national level.
I still think that I think this sector is still at a very nascent stage. I feel like this is also everyone has different priorities. Each state has different challenges, I feel, and the way they've been managing it. So I feel for this to, arrive at the sort of, become to expand nationally, I don't think there's not one solution for all. it's very landscape driven. It's very dependent on that. So I don't think about expanding. Honestly, that's not my plan for sure, to be everywhere or to do that. I think where we fail, not just in this sector, in many others, is all the information we have, we just hold it back to ourselves. And I think that's where we fail. This needs, or the work we are doing, whatever, like I said, I still feel we're at a nascent stage. I still feel we're learning a lot. But all the information we have, there is no platform to put it on right now. Because I'm not sure everyone...
We should talk about this because that's the reason why I asked you that question, that is this information available on a public domain?
Correct.
We should talk about it because end of the day, if you're looking at having a larger impact, people need to know. There has to be a platform where this information can be available and people can use it effectively.
Correct. I feel the people who need to use it, for example, the forest department has all the information because they are the ones who are going to be they are the ones who are actually going to take decisions and implement certain, things. So I feel that information is available to them. For example, the disease surveillance and that information that we have, that is shared out with all the relevant departments so that when they are making their plans, how much of this information is relevant to public, to general public? I think what general public needs to know is what work is happening, what databases are available. For example, as a layman, you can't keep wild animals at home. So essentially, the rehabilitation data is not necessarily important to the layman. It is very important to other rescue organizations.
Yeah, so for everything, there's an audience.
Yes.
And for this kind of work, if today there are only couple of organizations organizations who are doing this kind of work, but somebody wants to do it, person needs a head start.
Absolutely. So I think definitely there should be a platform where it should be open information for members on that. Like for example, in the US, you have the IWRC, I think the International Wildlife Rehabilitation Council, where they are collating information, but their structure is very different. You can become an official wildlife rehabilitator there by giving certain exams, and then you're a part of that, and then you have access to all this information that everyone has worked on and contributed. We don't have that platform. Maybe that's something to think about. Yeah.
That's a pretty good point which you can ponder on. You also have a One Health initiative. What is that?
So actually, if you look at the One Health approach, if you look at people, the environment, and animals are interconnected, right? A lot of the work that we do, and when you look at One Health's principles, number one, we act as an early disease detection center. These are animals that are coming to us from human-dominated landscapes. We're not rescuing animals from the forest.
Yeah.
They don't need rescue over there. The animals that are in human-dominated landscapes, which are coming to us, hurt, injured is one side of things, but the others that are coming sick. I mean, if COVID was a wake-up for anybody, we need to have a handle on what diseases are there. So from the disease side of things, we are the first people who come in contact with these animals. These animals are on our table. We make sure that, we are testing and making sure that everything is recorded and dealt with the way it should. Preventing injuries, preventing poor outcomes for people, all the work we do with human-wildlife conflict, that is a part of the One Health approach. Training, capacity building. We work with the government doctors at their state-level training centers to capacity build. We work with the forest department to train guards, to do all of that. So there's a lot of capacity building that we do as well. So all of this ties into the One Health approach. And, sharing data cross-sectorally. So in the sector, we do share data quite actively. It's just not done on a formal platform. But yes, everything that we do fits into that.
Is any disease which you guys could find it out and before it could spread, this was informed?
Ask that, Or do you even see trends? Like, for example, you'll have seasonally, you'll have trends.
Absolutely.
Or annually
seasonal trends we see all the time. We know what to expect at what time of the year now. We have 5 years data. We know what to expect when. We know. Sometimes we see it in different species. Like, for example, in 2021, when influenza hit, the avian influenza, and poultry had to be... and there was mass culling of poultry. I think that year we felt that we were seeing it in peacocks. And then the following year, we were seeing it in another bird species. And we haven't come across a zoonotic disease, I would say, which was never discovered before. But the one sort of discovery that we did make in collaboration with WRTC Gorewara, we kept getting these leopards. And you'll see a lot of these circulating on social media, okay? These disoriented leopards moving around in villages and all, people around it, thinking
I've
the leopard
seen
is
some
not
of those
doing anything.
videos.
You
I've
definitely
seen it.
have seen
100%
those.
I've seen.
Now, everyone thinks that's CDV. It is not like canine distemper, but it is not necessarily, and most of them have been testing negative for canine distemper. So we started getting leopards from certain regions where we were seeing symptoms. We were seeing seizures, we were seeing disorientation. Tested it for I don't know how many tests. We've literally stuck a leopard in the MRI machine, but to see if there's any other kind of lesions that we are missing, what is going on. Because I think the one thing is not just me, but even our veterinarians, we want to know, even if a death happens, we will want to know what the cause of death was. We will investigate into that, and try to find out. So we were like, what is going on with these leopards? We saw multiple things, had a few differentials, but just, couldn't nail it down. And then after collecting samples from almost, I think, 8 or 9 leopards, and after our tie-up with the WRTC Gorewara, they have an incredible lab, and they figured out that it was trypanosoma, which is a parasitic infection, and that is what was causing it. So there is no zoonotic relevance, but at least we know now what's happening. And in fact, I got calls from a couple of, other parts of the country where they were like, okay, there was something about where you guys had this, and I said, check for this. And it was exactly that.
So what happens to the leopard?
So they get really disoriented. They start showing as it progresses, you will see seizures. But what you will see is weakness and disorientation, and tremors and things like that. And that animal just becomes blank. And what happens is you treat it with antibiotics for a few days. It just perks back up. It's eating, it's doing. And then a lot of these animals end up getting released only to crash again in 7 days.
Okay.
So this is what was happening, because most people thought it was sick, tested negative for CDV, treated it, released it back. 7 days, you get a call again, with that animal. So it's basically trips. And when it progresses, there's no coming back from it. But now that we know what it is, if it's detected early, it can be treated. But it was one of those things that we discovered.
So can you tell me what a zoonotic disease is, and what are the common ones that you usually find?
So zoonotic disease is something that can transfer from animals to humans.
Okay.
And that is why it is of relevance. And also if you're talking about a virus, for example, if it, mutates, and, when it keeps the virulence keeps changing, the strains keep changing, sometimes it jumps species. There's several things that happens. But so if a disease, when do you say a disease is of zoonotic relevance, is when it is something that can transfer from animals to humans. So for example, rabies, something that we see in dogs, something that we see in wolves, we're seeing it in jackals, we're seeing it in hyenas. So again, when we are handling these animals, if you have to be very careful ourselves, because this is something that could affect us. You see a lot of brucellosis, you see salmonella, there's so many diseases that we are seeing in wildlife. And of course, the vector, which is the reason how it gets transmitted. So for example, how malaria, it's the mosquito that you get bit with. And so it's the vector which causes dengue or malaria. So in fact, peacocks we've seen with malaria, so it depends. It's what we are doing right now is even trying to understand what diseases are affecting wildlife, zoonotic and non-zoonotic in that sense. What parasites, again, so these all, for example, Lyme's disease is a big problem in other countries, not as big a problem in ours. We don't have that strain. But we're seeing a lot of different strains now in parasites. So I think this is also a lot of work hasn't been done on this because there wasn't enough accessibility to do so. So in fact, there are a lot of researchers who work with us now. So for example, there's somebody who is studying parasites in mammals. So now, because these animals are on our table, we are able to as a sort of byproduct, pluck those, ticks out or the, parasites out, store them, and then they'll come. So I feel a lot of information will come out now, and the researchers are focusing on their work, but they didn't have the opportunity to do this before. Also, the volume of animals we get for data or any kind of conclusion to be robust, you have to have a large enough sample size.
Yes.
So I think that's something that we are now in a position to do. Being a TTC, a transit treatment center, we are one of the first places that these animals come in. So whether it is disease screening, I think we are starting to understand what diseases are present, and we do have seasonal variances. We know when we are going to see a spike in CDV cases, like distemper cases. It's almost predictable now. So even with birds, also which different species get affected at different times of the year. So there's a lot of predicting that now, because now we have 5-6 years of data.
It's actually crazy. You don't think of all these things when you think of a rescue or
So
rehabilitation
that's
center.
the reason I wanted to go to zoonotic. Good, you brought the point in. So I have another question to ask on that. This is very layman question which I'm going to ask right now, is that apart from rabies and what happened in COVID, any other zoonotic disease which you have been aware of apart from these two?
So influenza is one, avian influenza. We haven't had, COVID has been the biggest outbreak so far. Don't think anything can match that.
Nothing
And a
can
lot
be
of the
matched.
others can be locally controlled, or if anyone is infected. But rabies is the other one. Again, we just recently tested a wolf that was positive, and a hyena, but that wolf had bitten almost, I think, 14 or 16 people.
Oh, wow.
And that was not a good situation. And
These people survived?
yes, they were all sent to get, vaccinated and get the immunoglobulins. But the wolf didn't survive, but it did test positive. So, and that was like the forest department, when they got that, they made sure that everyone they took the seriousness, because we were able to test it and confirm that, yes, this is rabies. We did a rapid test and we did the PCR and we said, this is definitely rabies. They made sure that, everyone got treatment, because you can't have, and imagine how that animal gets vilified if,
that's what I was just thinking,
if
what
that
would have
happens,
happened.
Anyway,
It's
the populations are dwindling. We don't want any more animosity towards them.
Wolf is a big issue in India as of now in terms of the species. So let us get back to the main topic, which you have been doing it, the wildlife rescue. How difficult it is to do a wildlife rescue in India. So we see, some of those documentaries and the video clips you'll see in Africa, plane is landing, a chopper is landing. So many people with all best possible tech and medical care, and then they go into it. How does it happen in India?
Listen, barring the helicopter, we are at par now. Okay. So barring the chopper, and also you see, we also in many cases don't need the chopper, simply because the landscape is different there. Even that, what we see, they can do that only in certain seasons.
You're right.
Okay. But in terms of tech, in terms of, yes, maybe we could do with a few more drugs which are hard to import in the country. Barring that, I think in terms of technology, we do have everything here now, and we are, and this is exactly, we didn't have it a few years back. We also have seen, learned, and, done that. The whole idea was to raise the standards of how wildlife rescue is done. So I think at this moment, whether it's using thermal drones to conduct wildlife capture or to assist veterinarians in doing chemical immobilization, it's been done successfully so many times. We are getting there with doing mass translocations. I think in terms of tech and equipment, we are not far behind. When I say we, I mean at least Maharashtra Forest Department and Rescue. There is huge scope for it to scale in our country. I think there's a handful of people who are doing that. Even in terms of veterinary care, I don't think we are very far behind.
Okay.
There's, in fact, one of the organizations that we've tied up with, Worldwide Vets, I remember one of their key personnel telling us that they run 26 global projects, and they came and spent 3 weeks with us. And they said, you have one of the highest wildlife loads here. where we have not seen across our 26 global projects. And they were really, really impressed with how we were managing things. In fact, our organization is race approved, which means for American students that are, if they come and volunteer here, or even the veterinarians that are come and volunteer with us, it contributes to their continuous education, to their points. So I think we're at par. We are race approved. We are doing as well. I think maybe in terms of certain drugs that don't have the import licenses, barring that, I think we are getting there. We're almost there, and there's always scope to improve. There is no
That is
doubt.
always there, but
yeah, I don't think we're that far behind. I think
for the people who are going to watch this podcast, I think they will be very excited because this is another way for them to contribute.
yeah.
You are actually showing a path that
Yeah.
this is also they can do it.
Yes.
So that is something amazing. Tell us some of those wildlife rescues which were really, really challenging.
The rescues. Okay. Well, I'll talk about both rescue and rehabilitation.
Sure.
So I
Because
think
that's my next question, so you can actually cover it.
okay. So I think every rescue is different. That's the first thing to understand. Every capture is different because the crowd around could be different. Maybe the capture is really simple, but becomes challenging because the crowd was not managed, right? Or was not we were not able to get it under control. Or everything is fine, but you know what? That animal is just behaving how it shouldn't. Or we don't know what's going on. But I think in terms of what's like challenging rescues, I think the one I remember from last year that was challenging was this leopard had gotten into a very densely populated area in Pimpri Chinchwad. And why it was challenging is because literally it was a probably 60-70 feet by 60-70 feet patch of bajra that was growing, where this leopard had gotten into a bungalow, gotten into a cattle shed, and then gotten into this thing. If that leopard got out of there, the throngs of people around, it would have definitely gotten killed or somebody would have gotten injured. What was challenging is that we did not have a shot to take because it was sitting right in the middle of that. And there was nothing around for us to take support. And I mean, in situations like this, you do have something called a golden hour. Like at least you have to manage the capture under 2 hours. Otherwise, it's going to be disastrous. Okay. So that was really challenging. Eventually, what we did is we reached out to the fire department. They had this sort of sky lift. And we got I remember sitting on the driver's seat of that car lift. A veterinarian was on the top, communicating through the walkie-talkies. And then he took a shot. And then the drone was monitoring. So everyone was in sync. And if even one cog, if it was out of place, it would have been a disaster. So I think that was really challenging and we managed to pull that off. I think I probably got a few gray hairs after that with the stress. but it all went off fine. That was quite challenging. I also think it's more challenging when, especially it's a problem leopard, So
this was not a problem leopard. It just
strayed in. So I think Dhule, there was a case where this leopard had attacked and killed 3 children in the span of a week, and the public pressure was really high, and we had to make sure we capture the right animal because there were other leopards. We wanted to make sure we catch the problem one.
Yeah, that's a discussion what we had with Vidya because half the time we don't even know which is a problematic
so we made sure to first understand which is the problem leopard. So
how did you figure it out?
So when the third incident happened, that's when we got to know. The first thing the team did there is to go there and just request people to just leave some of the clothes. Otherwise everyone is so emotional at that point. It's very hard to get, try to talk anyone into anything. And they left some of the, the blood and everything, that how it was, put camera traps. And literally the same evening. So it's very common for a leopard, if they they'll come back to their kill. So the leopard that came, we captured, got camera trap, footage of that. And we knew that is the one that we need to go after. There weren't multiple leopards in that same area, but you see when an incident like this happens and people will start calling you from everywhere, from like kilometers away that there's a leopard here or there. And you don't have to go for that one. And it's one that's going to be in and around this area, considering all the 3 kills that happened in that area. So you triangulate that. And then we did, we used the drones, we had to bait and capture it. In fact, on the bait, the wrong leopard came. In fact, we didn't capture that one.
Wow.
Because we were quite sure. We knew which one had to be caught. Also, when we captured that, of course, there's always this one element of doubt. Now, is it that one only that came on the kill? The rate at which it had been killing, there was a lot of livestock around for it to take, but it was still going for humans. So you knew it was a problem animal in that sense. Everything stopped right after. So we knew it was the right one as well. The team was still on alert just in case something else happens. But the one on the camera trap, the one which came on the bait, and the one which finally went into captivity, we made sure that it's documented properly. It's the same leopard. It's really important to pull out the right one, because, I mean, even like today, even WI reports will show you that, just arbitrarily relocating leopards is going to increase the conflict and not decrease it.
We had a very long discussion with Vidya about it, because most of the time animals are captured, leopards are captured, released somewhere else, far away from the home range, and those become more conflicting.
Problem animals, yeah.
One is what they become. The other thing is when you remove a mature individual who is not causing a problem from its home range. It's like removing the adult from the house
100%.
and the teenagers will come in and run the show. Now you imagine what is going to happen. It's pretty much like that. Yeah.
So we were talking about the rescue, and you spoke about some of the challenging rescues the team has done. I'm pretty sure that team also failed sometimes.
Failing is a part of it. See, on-field situations, I feel... what do you classify as failure, right? Like, for example, if a person gets injured during the rescue, I consider that a failure, right? That has not happened. Failure to capture, right? Now, I can give you multiple examples of that, actually. So, for example, there is, now it's rarely frequenting, but a leopard on the Pune airport, okay? And there are reasons always behind why you can't capture an animal. There is an extensive stormwater tunnel network that nobody has a map of. Not even the authorities have a map of. This leopard figured that these people can't access. He knows that inside out, the map is in his head, right? Couple of times where we did manage to capture, the weather has been challenging because of the rains. Last thing you want to do is block an animal in and it drowns itself. We've had to be so careful when to intervene, when not to intervene. So whether it was that, or there was a tiger which had a young tiger that had migrated from Tipeshwar to Dharashiv and Solapur. And we were monitoring it with the forest department. There were capture orders. Drug didn't work one time, And this has happened once with this tiger, and then once before it's happened with a leopard, where there is a drug resistance, or who knows in that chaos what really happened. That's the annoying part, when you don't always know. You can't sure shot say what happened. But I don't think it's about, I don't think there's been a case where, okay, the not being able to capture led to the death of the animal. That has not happened.
That is what I was actually talking about.
That has not happened. No, that has not happened so far. Failure in rehabilitation, I feel like, again, we have started doing post-release monitoring for several animals that we are able to do it for. So when do you know whether you've succeeded or failed? The entire circle. So this work doesn't end at just capturing the animal. After you capture the animal, how is an animal being housed or rehabilitated? Then you release it and do post-release monitoring.
Yeah.
Did it successfully survive in its natural habitat? Was it able to adapt? That's when you know whether you've really succeeded or failed, right? Rehabilitation failures are something which is like human imprinting. That doesn't really happen unless that animal has come with a history of being captive for a long time. Then our rehabilitation methods involve reversing the human imprinting. Most times we succeed, sometimes you don't. But that's already you're trying to untrain a trained animal, and this is when they've come from illegal captivity or something like that. So I wouldn't call them failures. They are setbacks because of the challenges, either the landscape or the preconditioning that it has come with. So it's something like that. Also, there's learnings from each one. There is no... Also, this thing that I said, we've started doing post-release monitoring for several animals now. And we've seen some really good outcomes. And I think that's what's really promising. I don't think there is anything called success or failure, because how do you measure these things, right?
No, I was more referring to the death.
The death.
Yeah. So death of the
deaths.
animal.
So see, this is another thing, everyone's very, you are a transit treatment center. Unlike domestic animals or pets where you start noticing symptoms, wildlife come to you in end stage. Firstly, because they are not around humans, right? You will notice them when they are literally recumbent or stuck in some major distress.
Yeah.
So firstly, animals are coming to you in a very critical condition. So essentially think of it like a emergency room or a casualty ward, right? You've come in a very, very horrible condition. Life and death is a normal part. In fact, if you are worried about things like that, you shouldn't be doing this work only. Death is going to happen. The best you can do is try, and make sure. In fact, so many times when animals even pass away, I feel any death should not go in vain. We make sure we do a postmortem. We will, run everything. Even in death, that animal serves a purpose. So I feel like death is going to happen. Sometimes you've probably done everything right, or you think right, but the animal passes away. Sometimes you just don't know. There is a lot of unpredictability, in this whole thing. I mean, we are dealing with wild animals, so it's a part and parcel of it.
No, same thing. We spoke about you spoke about human imprinting. What is what that is?
Human imprinting is basically when a wild animal becomes comfortable around humans. So the future survivability for a wild animal depends on the fact that it should be able to keep its distance from you. So most, there have been people who have come to the center, people who maybe did not understand that much about wild animals. They're like, why is this animal scared of you? Why is it always hiding? I said, that's exactly what a successful rehabilitation means. That animal should keep its distance from you. If I start... there is, everyone has this picture of Snow White and Seven Dwarfs in their head, her with all the animals around. That is not wildlife rehabilitation. That is a fairy tale. Wildlife rehabilitation is nothing like that. In fact, it's about the animal, as soon as you even walk past the enclosure, it going into its hide. But to do that successfully, you have to ensure that it has a hide. Otherwise, it's going to continuously see you and start getting okay with that. Even orphans that come to us, we've over time figured out that critical age where they quickly transition from being fed artificially or hand fed. We also use certain techniques to make sure the animals don't realize it's actually the human feeding them, and then cut that human interaction off. Now, for example, certain species like deer, antelope, or if you say primates, they often come often, and especially with primates, for example, you will have only one rehabilitator who will handle them. And when they reach that critical age, they will get integrated into another group of animals, so of the same species. And that rehabilitator that they associate the slightest bit of safety with, they'll never see that person in their life again. So they don't associate it with humans, but they associate it with that person. And that, in fact... which is why rehabilitation work is hard, because there's no space for those kind of emotions. You can't get attached to these animals. You have to know when to cut off. So imprinting is when, if I was if I was coming into the enclosure and that deer came to me, that essentially means I've imprinted on it and it's comfortable being around me. In fact, it's one of our rehabilitation milestone tests that if we go into the enclosure, is that animal running off and hiding? That's a check mark for us.
So, imprinting in zoo animals. Is it okay?
I think in zoo animals it's okay because what happens is their purpose is different. Also, when they're required to be treated, they are much more comfortable being treated. Otherwise, it becomes a traumatic experience for them. So I think that wildlife and zoos just have to be looked at for the physical form. Essentially, to me, they are domesticated animals after they're in a zoo.
Yeah, but there are certain incidences, like for example, if I talk about Dr. Ramte, a lot of people go to him with the injured animals, and those animals are actually living there. And they have a human imprint because they are very comfortable with the humans around.
I think the videos that you usually have.
So what you are talking about, whether
I've seen one more actually, one of the caretakers in Banagatta National Zoo or whatever.
It's
zoo.
quite a viral video.
Yeah, it's a very viral video in which
I
that,
think human imprinting, what you are talking about is a human interaction with the wild animal. Okay, that is different from imprinting. Imprinting essentially means that this animal is comfortable around you and is dependent on you for something. So that person who's feeding parakeets outside their balcony on a daily basis, that is also human imprinting. Because an animal is coming to it when it's called, it's coming for something. What you are talking about is basically treating a wild cat like a domestic cat. This is about creating those human emotions and that dependency and all of that. I don't agree with that personally, okay? Because if it is an animal that has to go back into the wild, there is no doing any of that. If that animal is going to be captive for life, also let's understand one thing. As per our CZA rules, okay, Central Zoo Authority rules, what animals classify for display? The ones who look, they are, so for example, why can't you put up debilitated or injured animals on zoo display? Because as per that, the animals that people who go to zoos and see zoos, they have to see the form of animal that they will see in the wild, technically. Now, a wild cat in a zoo, their behavior is completely different from which is why I am not a very big fan of I think that, that is not the true behavior of that animal. That animal is just behaving like a big puddy cat in the zoo. Okay. And I think we put across the wrong impression to such impressionable minds in zoos, and whether it's through the media as well, of feeding animals or, showing those human connections. And that, in fact, I think it tugs some strings in people, and then everyone wants to do that. And they think that they view that as a noble act.
Counterproductive, basically.
I feel like keeping wildlife wild is the most important thing. And as a person who is working with animals, may it be anybody else, you have to be very careful about what you project out also. So for example, we have a couple of leopards that are in care right now who came as orphan cubs. There is something called target training, which means we are training it enough to come to a certain place to be able to put its paw out so we can treat it comfortably. That's not human imprinting, that's target training, because we know that animal is going to be captive for life. That is different. When you talk about zoos and displaying that, I don't know. I mean, I personally am not okay with it, because I feel like everyone wants to emulate you then. And these are wild animals. And is that really the impression you want to put out there in the world? So I don't necessarily agree with
even
with
if
that.
it is going to be in captivity for life, even if it is often leopard cubs, as much less interaction we have.
Absolutely. So, see, an animal in captivity, no matter how big your enclosure, okay, it is not equivalent to what it would get naturally. For whatever unfortunate circumstances it is ended up in captivity, the least you can do is try to provide it whatever welfare you can in captivity. Now, when providing it welfare, it means reducing the stress, minimizing captivity stress. So what contributes to captivity stress? Annual checkups, when the animal is sick, medical checkups, those kind of things. If something, for example, elephants, they need their feet to be groomed very regularly, right? They need, so instead of stressing out the animal while doing that, in fact, target training is done for several, different wild animals who are going to be in wildlife captivity. But it is for that purpose of medical treatment or an XYZ thing, not to show to the world your bond with the animal.
Yeah,
This
the
bonding
bonding,
with
affection
wildlife,
with the
this
wildlife.
affection
Yeah.
Playing
is
with the leopard cub in your...
no. So that is not what is the purpose of that.
Yeah.
There's no good outcome for the animal from that. So there's no way it is benefiting.
Yeah.
Let me
That's
put
what-
it that way.
So most of the time in those videos, it's more to show that how much of affection they have on these
Affection.
animals, how the keepers are taking care of them.
Yeah, means I've seen these two specific videos, and I was just thinking that why a regional, I'm calling it a newspaper as a regional newspaper, but it's a very prominent newspaper, has published a full video about this person who is bonded with the leopards and leopard cubs, and
yeah.
she's feeding them literally in the hand.
Mm.
So I don't know about this case very much, but I'll tell you one thing. Notice this in primates especially. It's the actual rehabilitation process. If they don't have something to cling on to, it does not have to be a human. We found substitutes. Okay. Because again, we know end goal. We want to send this animal back into the wild, right? So you find substitutes, you find things, because if they don't have that stress, that distress of not having something to hang on to, that security, that's what kills them, not anything else, right? So you have to find ways to substitute it. But in general, I mean, this whole forming bonds with wildlife, personal, emotional bonds with individual animals or wildlife, I don't believe it projects the right message to the common person who is fascinated by these animals and then somewhere wants to do that.
Yeah.
And then you'll end up in some countries wanting to bottle feed tiger cubs or take selfies with them, which is so ridiculous.
You had incidences where you have got the orphaned animals and
Several.
then you have released back successfully in the
Yes.
wild.
There was
Including a striped hyena, which was hardly some 100, 200 or 400 grams. and
no, it was about 600 odd grams when it came. It was a lone hyena often that was found. And see, for animals like this, generally they get raised and then go into captivity for life. And that is the outcome. And my thought was like, why? Why can't we try?
Yeah.
So when it came, again, there was a proper process from day one. The plan was thought out. Of course, you keep improvising on the way. But one thing that I've seen, with animals, and this hyena, by the way, it was about 21 kilos when we finally released it. And we did put a collar on it and we did track it. Even the behaviors she showed, we say the mother teaches them everything and things like that, right? But firstly, this is a scavenging animal.
Yeah.
So we also knew what we were setting it up for. And so we had to also pick the, release spot carefully to understand whether it's going to get what it needs, simulate those situations in the center as well. And what I'm really fascinated by, especially with wild animals, that, if you step back, like as a human, you step back with intervention and allow them to express their behaviors and throw the right elements for them to let that instinct remain wild, they retain it. They know it. I think it's just genetically fed into them. They just know it. Like she was exhibiting all the pasting behavior, digging dens up. I know how much we had to reinforce everything outside, and doing all of that, hiding her food, going back to it after days. So you think, this animal's with us, we have to give it fresh food every day. No. We are not a zoo. We are not keeping it for that purpose. We are raising it to be wild. And I think, and I'm, again, and this is why I feel like working with the Maharashtra Forest Department has been really incredible, because they've also been very encouraging, because everyone realizes that all these animals ending up in captivity is neither good for the animal, it's a burden on resources. And if we don't, especially with the world, the way it is changing around us, the environment, if we don't start pushing these animals back out, it's going to be a disaster for us as well as for them. Yeah. And then there's no welfare involved, there's no justification of the use of resources. So it's not about rescuing that one animal or rehabilitating that one animal. And her post-release monitoring data showed us that she was doing absolutely fine. It was an area where there were, she was being monitored by she was spotted because she had a collar on her. She was fine. She was absolutely okay. So all these, I think, again, we're at a very nascent stage, We've done it with rusty spotted cats. We've done it with so many birds, so many mammals.
Numero,
Yeah, that was just something I came up with, because it was the first one.
Yeah, the smallest cat.
Again, so that was again very similar, where I was just like, all these kittens get discovered in the fields during harvesting.
Yeah.
99% times we managed to do the reunion with the mother on field itself, how much ever time it takes. But sometimes, everything is the entire area is disturbed and the mother just moves on. Or
Can you share that story about the rusty spotted cat?
Yeah, so generally with rusty spotted cats, what happens is during harvesting, the kittens get discovered.
Sugarcane harvesting.
Sugarcane, mostly sugarcane. And then we normally the farmer, whoever informs forest department, who will then inform us, we then go there and then track where the mother potentially. First thing is you halt the harvesting. You request the farmer to wait for a day or two, and then track the mother, set up. Again, based on species. So if it's a rusty, it's a slightly different setup. If it's a leopard cub, it's a different setup. If it's a jackal, it's a different setup. If it's a jungle cat, it's slightly different again. Because all these animals behave a little differently, get spooked out by different kinds of setups. So over time, we figured out what works for what. And then it's monitored through live cameras, and the team is there until the mother takes all the young ones away. In cases, sometimes you get informed very late. So if somebody's just discovered it, which generally happens by the time the harvesting starts in the morning. By the time the message reaches you, it's 1, 2 in the afternoon. You need to finish your setup by 6, 7 latest. So you're always scrambling, right, to get it done in time. And then if even on day one, so there have been times where we've tried for 4, 5, 6 days and then gotten success, But sometimes, when the area is completely disturbed and there's been zero sign of the mother, the team is also constantly tracking in the area for other signs. We set up a lot of camera traps. And if we know that these are abandoned, these are the unfortunate ones that come into captivity. Now, instead of them just remaining in captivity for their entire life, we were like, okay, let's work this out in a way. So we also know that they will be released back in a similar landscape because that's where they came from. So even the enrichment we put in the enclosure mimics that, and in fact, the rusties are the most feistiest. Huh? So I feel like the smaller the cat, the feistier cat. In fact, the leopards are all just fine. They will look at you and just go away. The rusty will just hiss at you. So even when they're kittens, they're really, really feisty. So this one that was there, I remember saying that why can't we, raise it to be wild and let's try. And then again, like I said, the department was quite supportive and they said, they saw that we had a plan. They were like, okay, what's the plan? Put it in writing. Like, what's the plan and how you're going to monitor it? It should be, we can't just do this arbitrarily. So there was a proper plan. At what month, what kind of behaviors are we looking at? What it should achieve in terms of physical growth, in terms of nutrition, in terms of everything. So each animal at rescue has sort of a rehabilitation milestone checklist. It's like an exam. You clear all the points, you're ready for release. So
much of work.
Yeah, for each different species is a different thing. So this one went through it all, and I still remember the day we went to release it. We had placed the unit in the area where we thought, okay, let it get used to the, temperatures and everything around. And I remember just going a little close because I couldn't spot it in the cage. And I was like, hiss on my face. I said, look at this little thing. I was just like, we looked after you for so many months. And you're like,
which is the right thing.
Which is the right thing. Yeah. And that's in that moment, I knew that this animal is going to do fine.
Yeah.
It's not going to be like some domestic cat going into someone's house, that kind of thing. It didn't want nothing to do with us. The minute we opened, it darted out. And that's that, So that was the first one. And there have been several more after that. So I feel like every time you try something that hasn't been done, yes, there will be a lot of questions that will be asked. But if you have a plan and if you're approaching this, scientifically, methodically, I feel like it's just so much better for the animal and then so much better for everyone's resources in the future. So yeah.
So I think when it comes to keeping, being attached to these animals, you're very clear that it's better that you don't have anything. I think naming wild animals has been, especially in the photography community and media landscape, you have this tiger T1 and T2, and there's this whole thing about naming animals and following them and making
So
sure.
T1, T2 is okay.
That
Here
is
we are
actually
talking
a
about,
okay
that is
thing.
still fine.
Yeah.
The problem
You're
is things
talking
like
about
calling something like calling a tiger Avni
Avni,
or doing that
Ustad,
because yeah.
Munna,
So-
Prince.
Yeah.
Again, this is a very personal opinion. I feel that wild animals shouldn't be named.
But tell
Simply,
me one thing. I know your opinion. I'm sorry to cut you, but I think tiger doesn't know that he has a name. How does it make a difference?
so see, everyone has different. I have spoken to people who have sort of named, certain animals that they've been monitoring and things like that, and they say that. My problem is when, especially because we deal with human wildlife conflict, right? And then people are when hard decisions need to be taken, then there's all the emotions that come in. Sometimes, in fact, yes, you have to be very passionate to do work with wildlife, but you also have to be very practical. Sometimes you have to take hard decisions and things like that. And then these cause problems for the forest department in the future, or for any policymaker, anyone to take decisions on certain things. The animal doesn't know the name. That is a different story altogether. But I don't believe that a lot of people say, you know what, people will get more attached to wildlife. They will view it with a different lens if they have the name. Then it will get protected. I don't know about that. I don't know about that.
What we spoke about some time ago is a misplaced sentiments.
Yeah. Correct.
Yeah, misguided compassion. I feel it's
completely misguided.
In fact, I'll tell you, if you have, you do that and people start identifying that animal,
Yeah.
the day if that animal ever becomes a problem, you will, or it passes away or something like that for a natural cause. Not everyone understands what happened, really went behind it, that no one's necessarily responsible for it. Or if it gets into conflict, this was the problem animal. I feel like let tiger be tiger, let a wolf be a wolf, let a leopard be a leopard. There's no need to give names to it. Internally, yes, we could name it, say in the organization if it is a animal that's in lifetime captivity. But that's more of a reference thing. It's not something that you'd put out. I also think especially if you are in a position of influence or you're putting something like that out, your responsibility is higher not to do that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm not okay with it personally, but everyone has different views on this thing. So
I mean, end of the day, if you're seeing the same animal and trying to build a bond with that animal, there is a problem.
And then everyone wants to get a little bit of that animal,
that's right.
which
You're
means that
absolutely
everyone
right.
will try to get a photo of XYZ animal.
You're right.
And then you don't know what is happening. You might be responsible, but is the next and the next person. So I don't know.
I think it's another form of human greed. I think you just want a bit of that.
You want to
action.
attach something of yours. To it.
Is your organization also involved in the trafficking issues? Wildlife?
So we basically, if the forest department does a seizure, or it could be the customs, or it could be even the police at times, we don't get into the seizure part of it or the raids or anything like that, but we are the people who end up handling those animals. So once the seizure is done,
the seizure is happening, I understand forest department knows how to handle it. How does it go with customs and police? They have no idea how to handle. Like, for example, I remember seeing a social media post in somebody's bathroom, they found a orangutan in Mumbai.
So that, in fact, so when that happens, so whether it is customs now, even the seizures that are happening on the airport in such high numbers, right? We had one recently in Pune, Mumbai. It's a very common thing. Chennai, so many of these places. NGOs who are authorized by the forest department to handle these animals come in at that point. We are only temporary custodians. We don't have a final say on what happens with the animal. But while the animal, so we get called almost immediately, and they also know, they keep us on alert. If they know what animals are there, they'll keep us on alert as well that we may need you to step in. So if the animals are there, then we'll step in. We'll only do the animal management part of it and making sure that they are looked after while the final decision about them or while the case is going on. So in many of the cases which are coming, which are getting caught at the airport, they are being deported back to their port of origin.
Oh, okay.
So, yes, which is actually the right thing to do. So these animals are basically, while they are still here and the paperwork and all of that is getting done, they generally remain in our care. And then they get deported back. Sometimes if they have to move to a lifetime care facility, it is a decision of whichever department has done the case, whether it's the customs, forest and police, or it's their decision where the animal goes.
So these trafficking incidences, what we are talking about is largely as pets. They are getting into India because somebody is exporting it and then want to sell it as exotic pet.
Yeah, so I think, this is a very rising problem in this country, the exotic pet trade. So clearly there is a demand for it, which people really need to start. It's, demand is, it is demand which drives the supply of this. So I feel it is people who need to become more aware and stop demanding these animals as pets. It is when it will reduce but yeah, it is entirely the pet trade. There is nothing else that is currently fueling this.
Have you ever met somebody who has got an exotic pet? Why did they get that pet?
It's always a status thing. It's always or a cool factor. I think I think there need to be way more awareness campaigns about how it is not cool to keep wild pets, and how they say adopt, don't shop. I think it needs to become, it is not cool to have a wild pet. That needs to really happen, because it's almost like owning a dog or a cat is not cool enough anymore, or having a hamster potentially is not cool enough anymore, but they must have a snake or an iguana, or I don't know, the primates that are also there. People own kangaroos. Why? Because it's okay to trade in that, and those are permitted. So
I think, but there are, most of the animals that are coming in, like these sugar gliders and all of these iguanas and all these things, the government, some of these animals are legally, at least in India, some of these animals are legal, right? Not the Indian species.
So see, this is, again, so there's a lot of, the 2022 amendment, which happened, this also included now all the CITES species in Appendix 1 and 2. And basically what the thing is now is, of course, Indian wildlife is off the books. You cannot have them as pets. So everybody who has all these Alexandrine and rose-ring parakeets and plum-headed parakeets and Indian star tortoises and, all that jazz, those are just illegal to keep. You are not permitted to keep those. That is clear.
That's understood.
Okay?
Yeah.
A lot of people don't know that.
Yeah.
Even now. But there's no gray area there. Now, what happens with the exotic pets, which means they are not native to India.
So exotic is more to talk
Non-Indian.
about
Non-native.
non-native species.
Now, for example, the African grey parrot, right? So it was a grey area before. Grey area. So during COVID, in fact, there was this, I think it was like an amnesty scheme. There was 6 months period given, which got extended. A Parivesh portal where you had to declare what animals you have. And then that had come. So whoever had these species had to declare them, right? Then that time period got over. Then the amendment came. Now the thing is, it's not about whether you're permitted or not to keep it. It is not about the fact that you declare it through Parivesh. Are you able to prove the import of these animals? Why are these animals getting smuggled in bags if they are legal to import? Right?
Yeah.
Because the paperwork to import them, these guys don't want to do all of that.
Easy way out.
Expensive also, I think.
Expensive.
The
And
process will be very cumbersome.
process is cumbersome. They just want
I
to
don't
make a
think
quick
so it's
buck.
to do with the expensive, because they are anyhow spending loads of money in getting these animals.
So it's not about the expensive. It's just about
process.
It's just about the process. It's just how it's been happening, right? So if you, for example, go tomorrow and somebody is selling you an African grey parakeet, you're not allowed to keep that. And if you go to declare it on Parivesh, you have to tell what your source is.
Correct.
Now, if you are buying it from an next person, he has to have import papers. Right? Which you will have to then declare. This is what people don't know. And also, you see, I think India has some incredible laws when it comes to wildlife protection. However, when it comes to implementation, we are at different stages with these things and implementation has not happened, So I think that is the main place where we need to really, really catch up, because if that happens, then a lot of this will come into check. Because then a person who wants this pet will realize that it's also painful for me to have this pet. They should, it's easy to have one now because you will just go to a pet shop and get a sugar glider or one of these bizarre colored snakes and, you can have it and nobody's going to question you. And then you will say, कोई system ही नहीं है करने को. So that system needs to come up to where they can declare and to do all of that. Because when that person goes to that person who's selling it to them and says, give me the import papers so that I can declare it because I have to do that legally, that's when things will change. But that system needs to come in.
In simple words, if I had to say it, wildlife fascinates people, largely. Whoever is remotely also connected with the wildlife, it fascinates people. It's a jungle, wild animal behavior. A lot we don't know about them. And that's the reason why we are fascinated with that world. That is the reality. The problem is that if you show the wrong information to them, they will have a wrong perception about the wildlife. And that is where is the major issue which we see, because we are just showing one thing which is not real. Okay, so let's make it slightly lighter. There are a lot of myths and let's burst some myths. So there is something which has been given to me and talking about it. If you touch a baby animal, the mother will reject it.
No, not if you just touch it. It depends. Okay, so what is the reason behind this? Okay, the reason behind it is, so if you see any of our reunion videos, you always see our boys wearing gloves and then touching the animal. It's not about the fact that you touch the animal. It's about you leaving your human scent on that animal. And depending on the species of the animal, if it views humans as a threat or it smells that, it may view that it as a threat and thus abandon the animal. So if you are going to lift an animal, you use gloves to do it. But it's not necessary that an animal gets abandoned. It can, because you see, before we arrived at the scene, so now for example, the rusty spotted cats that I was telling you, before we arrived at the scene and used gloves, 10 other people had touched that kitten. We do, because we want to increase our chances of reunion. We'll take some leaves and we'll just rub the animal in its own urine just to not give the mother the remotest chance to do that. So it's not necessary. It's also very species dependent. A leopard cub, you pick it up with your hand. I mean, you shouldn't, because, you're taking safety, disease control, any infections, this, that. It's the right thing to do to always have gloves. Leopard is a bolder animal. It is not going, its maternal instinct to retrieve its cubs when it can is far stronger. So a little bit of human scent on it is not going to really spook it out. With birds and things like that, people worry about that.
With squirrels, I think that's where it...
Again,
does it happen with squirrels?
Not necessarily. It's a very it's very dependent on. Oh, why should you be touching squirrels?
No, I'm just asking. Like, you found a
I think the
baby
usual scenario is
squirrel.
you have it's living in on the roof or
Correct.
something, and then
It
you have
falls.
the baby is fallen down.
Somebody
It's
has
not
picked it
if
up.
you put it back in its nest, and there is some human scent on it, but it's back in its nesting spot. It's not necessary that the
Same thing goes with the birds also.
It's pretty same with the birds, but I mean, with the amount of diseases and things around, I'm not like I'm a germaphobe or anything like that. It's just basic safety. You should not be picking up a wild animal without gloves. It's as simple as that.
Another common thing is I think you have lots of baby birds. They're just fledging, and usually the natural process is they're on the branch, and then as they try to fly, they fall down.
Correct.
And I think with good intentions, what people do is there are cats around. They don't want the bird to be eaten, so again, they immediately pick it up, and this is to feed it milk or feed it glucose water or something.
So this feeding is really something that should be avoided. They again done with good intention, but a lot of times, especially when they're trying to feed food or something like that, in fact, people come to us with these birds. They say, "Oh, I just fed it water," but unfortunately, if it doesn't go into the right space, it could aspirate or choke. In that sense. So sometimes, in trying to do something good, you actually end up killing the animal. Which it kills the animals. So what we often tell people, if an animal, again, fledglings, most times, if there is no immediate threat around, or put it in a location or be around to make sure the free-ranging predator is not getting to them until they hop back up. So again, this is one of those things we counsel people on the phone. A lot of people get upset, they came and they didn't go take the bird and go. But you didn't need to take the bird and go. Many times we've put the animals back in their nest and it's been fine.
Yeah.
But if we always tell people, if you find a hurt or injured animal, don't feed it food and water. It's okay, animals, it has to be, it's better not to do it, and then if there is a rescue center or something that you can take it to, then of course do that. But when you are stressed, or if you have an injury and fall, the last thing you want to do is eat food.
Yeah, you're right.
So you don't want to be shoving something down the throat of an animal when you found them hurt or injured. You can put water around. If the animal wants to do it on its own, it can do that.
So through this podcast, if you have to give 3 messages to people when they see the wildlife around them, either injured, abandoned, or any of these kind of cases, what are the 3 messages you would like to pass on to the people?
Okay. So first and foremost, I say this, I can't always say call a rescue organization because they aren't there everywhere. But if an animal is injured or abandoned, before you intervene, from a distance, take photographs, videos, send it, contact your local forest department. There is a number 1926 where you can call and it will route your call.
That 1926 is the India number. Not specific to a state.
No, I don't think it's specific.
Okay, so
I will double check this, but I think 1926 is something you can call for wildlife.
Or you can just Google, which is the
exactly
number,
your local forest department.
Yes,
number and call them up. Exactly. Yeah. So the right thing to do would be to inform the authorities. I think people forget that all wild animals listed under the Wildlife Protection Act is government property. You cannot domesticate them. So please keep wildlife wild. You cannot take them home and raise them. I think the one important message, if it's only about injured animals that I'm saying, I said, remember that they are government property. You must call up the forest department. They are the authority that should be, and their authorized organizations are the ones who should be dealing with these. I would say, if you are someone who feels sensitively about this, have some basic, have a very basic kit at home, like a box, a piece of cloth, and a pair of gloves. So that if you see an injured bird, before other predators or anything gets to it, just pick it up, put it in the box, make some holes in it, and keep it in a quiet place. It's probably one of the best things you can do for the animal, allow it to do that, and then call the authorities. That's the second thing. I can't think of a third thing. Yeah. In fact, with wildlife, the lesser you intervene, the better it is.
That's the third one.
Yeah, that's the third one.
Also, very frankly, I remember meeting you way back in Pune while we were shooting something somewhere around that area. And I remember meeting you. And I was very fascinated from that day, the kind of work, what you're doing it. Because I know there are not too many rescue organizations in India. And I'm very fortunate. We are very fortunate to have you sitting here and talking about the kind of work, what you have done till date. And good luck to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.